We begin my top 36 remaining wide receiver rankings with wide receivers that I think are probably low end wide receiver threes. Remember that players who played in Thursday night's game are not included in these rankings, so if you see somebody missing and they played on Thursday, that's why. Troy Franklin is playing against Carolina. I do think he scores a touchdown in this one. I believe that Cortland Sutton's a decent play. Lucas Kroll is. I think that all the running backs are going to see a roughly even utilization. I think Denver is going to crush Carolina with them starting Bryce Young. And so I don't think any one particular player besides Bo Nix is going to finish at the top of their position, but I think that they're all very high upside plays. And I do think once again that Franklin scores a touchdown, so I think he's a pretty good play this week as a wide receiver three. Roma Dunze is playing against Washington this week. They are very susceptible to the pass. I think he gets a couple chunk gains in this one, and I think that he's a pretty safe floor option. I do think he sees more involvement after the bye. Then we have Wandale against Pittsburgh. He is a very underappreciated wide receiver. Considering he's not really an elite asset, he is one of the safest floor options in the game. In a full PPR at least, it's a pretty strange week if he doesn't have at least around 9 to 10 points. And so I think he's one of the safer options in terms of wide receiver threes. I just don't think that this is one of those 18 point upside games from him. And now we have wide receivers that I think are generally mid to high end wide receiver threes. We have Cortland Sutton, Romeo Dobbs, Xavier Worthy, Cedric Tillman, Marvin Harrison Jr., Terry McLaurin, and JSN. Cortland Sutton was cardio Sutton last week, no production at all. I don't expect that to repeat. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he's pretty heavily involved in the passing game. Romeo Dobbs is playing against Jacksonville. I do think after seeing more involvement this past week, that's going to continue. It is a little bit tough to project as to who the wide receiver two is any given week with them having Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks, and Dobbs. I don't think there's anybody physical enough on Jacksonville to match up with Dobbs, and so for that reason, I think he would be the preferred play as the wide receiver two for Green Bay this week. Xavier Worthy is playing against Las Vegas. I think he gets a couple chunk gains and is involved in the ground. I don't project a touchdown, but I think he's a decent flex play this week. Cedric Tillman is going to be playing against Baltimore this week. He saw 12 targets this past week, and I believe he finished as a top 10 wide receiver in a full PPR. I don't project that kind of game again, but I think he's a very safe option, and he made a strong case to be the number one target for Jameis Winston. And so we'll have to see how this plays out. If he retains anywhere near that amount of a target share and total volume, he's going to be vaulting up these rankings, but I do want to see it for one more week. MHJ is playing against Jalen Ramsey and the Dolphins. In a better matchup, I'd be higher on him. I do think that is as tough as it gets. They've been isolating him as an X wide receiver, having him run the big boy routes. And so I think they're going to have Ramsey shadow him, and I really just don't like that matchup for MHJ. I'd like to see the connection grow between him and Kyler because MHJ, despite the lack of production, is winning. He's getting open. I just want to see a better matchup and more of a connection between the two. Then we have Terry McLaurin playing against Chicago. This projection is with Jaden Daniels missing this game. If Daniels plays, I'd project a better game for him. I think with Marcus Mariota, though, and playing against Chicago's vaunted pass defense, that this is a matchup to avoid. But at the same time, Terry McLaurin, I still think is a reasonably safe wide receiver three this week. I just don't think we have that top 10 potential that we do on some other weeks. JSN is playing against Buffalo this week. I think they're going to have to pass the ball. This is also with DK Metcalf missing this game. I think that leads to an increase in total target share. And so I do think that he's a much better play than most weeks this week. Now we have wide receivers that I think are probably in that low end wide receiver two range to potentially mid wide receiver two range. We have Chris Olave, Darnell Mooney, Devontae Smith, Keenan Allen, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, Jalen McMillan, T. Higgins, Devontae Adams, and Jalen Waddle. Chris Olave is matched up against the Chargers. That is a tough matchup. I do think that he sees a good amount of volume in this game, though. And so for that reason, I think he's a reasonably safe floor option. I don't think we see one of those high upside weeks from him, though. But I doubt you can afford to sit him. Darnell Mooney is playing against Tampa Bay. I don't project him for a touchdown, but I think he sees a substantial amount of volume. I love all of the playmakers, the skill position players on both sides of the ball in this one. And so I think he's a very solid, high upside play this week. Devontae Smith is playing against Cincinnati. He had an uncharacteristically bad week this past week. I think he returns to being a solid wide receiver too. I just don't project a touchdown for him. Keenan Allen is playing against Washington this week. Before the bye, he had a 2 touchdown game. I do think he scores a touchdown in this one, and so I do think that he's a solid high upside play. We have George Pickens against the Giants. It was very interesting. Justin Fields, I don't know if afraid is the right word, but he wasn't really throwing it deep and just trusting George Pickens to come down with it. Whereas Russell Wilson immediately did that, and against the Jets and Sauce Gardner a good amount of the time too. Uh, that was successful. Who would have figured George Pickens could be a contested catch king? Nobody, right? So that is encouraging. And so I do think that he continues to see a good amount of volume. I don't think he scores in this one, but I do project him to have a pretty solid game. Amari Cooper is playing in Seattle this week. This is his second week with Buffalo. I think that he's a very high upside play. I don't think he scores a touchdown in this one, but I think that in the future, once we see uh, a very high snap share and more of an understanding of the playbook and the connection grows between the two of them, I think this guy has absolute top 10 weekly upside with Josh Allen throwing him the ball. And so I do think that in the future, I'm going to trust him a lot more, but I do want to see what his involvement looks like in his second week with Buffalo. Then we have Tyler Lockett against Buffalo. I think that he turns into the 1A to JSN's 1B against Buffalo. I do think that I would prefer him slightly over JSN. I think both are solid plays this week, although it isn't an easy matchup. Buffalo's pass defense can be pretty stingy, but nonetheless, he's a strong play. Jalen McMillan is playing against Atlanta this week. It's tough to know who's going to be the wide receiver one. It could be Trey Palmer, it could be Shepard. I think it's going to be McMillan, but I also think that Kate Otten, as well as the running backs, are going to receive much more of the target share with Evans and Godwin out. So I think that McMillan is potentially the strongest play this week. We'll have to see how that plays out, but I do project him to be the wide receiver one in Evans' absence. T. Higgins is playing against Philly. He's been awesome recently. I don't project a touchdown for him, but I do think he has a very solid game overall. Then we have Devontae Adams against New England. He's going to receive more and more involvement in this offense. He already has a history with Rodgers. I don't think he scores a touchdown in this one, but I think he has a pretty solid game overall. I do think we need to see what the target share looks like between him and Garrett Wilson on a week-to-week basis. This past week, it was 9 and 9 apiece. So we'll have to keep track of that. But I also think that Devontae Adams sees a lot of Christian Gonzalez in this one, which is a tough matchup. So I do think that curbs his upside to a degree, but I still think with him and Aaron Rodgers being connected that he's a very strong play. Then we have Jalen Waddle against Arizona. Finally, we can start skill position players for Miami again. Thank you. I think he's an incredibly high upside play. I think he gets a couple chunk gains. I just don't project a touchdown for him in this one. If you like what you're hearing and seeing so far, feel free to like and subscribe. I project out all the non-Thursday night games, so make sure to check out my quarterback, running back, and tight end rankings as well. And yeah, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, like and subscribe. Thanks. Now we have wide receivers that I think are probably high-end wide receiver twos to potentially low-end wide receiver ones. We have Zay Flowers, Garrett Wilson, Tank Dell, Jaden Reed, and Deebo Samuel. Zay Flowers, after 2 incredible weeks, tweaked his ankle this past week against the Buccaneers, and so he didn't have the game that I projected. I think he returns to being a very solid play for us this week. Garrett Wilson is playing against New England. I think that Christian Gonzalez sees a lot more Devontae Adams than Garrett Wilson, and so I think that Garrett Wilson has the better game in this one. In Adams' first game with Wilson, they both saw 9 targets, so we will have to keep track as to if there's a distinct wide receiver one on a week-to-week basis, if they're kind of a 1A, 1B on a week-to-week basis. That will be interesting, but I do think to a degree that really does help Garrett Wilson out because it's going to be basically impossible to bracket him anymore because if you do that, Devontae Adams is going to crush you. So I do think that makes his life easier in a way while also capping his max upside. But nonetheless, I think he's a pretty good play this week. Then we have Tank Dell against Indianapolis. He was shut out this past week. He almost had 2 receiving touchdowns, though. In general, in games in which Nico Collins or Stephon Diggs misses, I think that he's a very strong play. Indianapolis' pass defense is atrocious. I don't expect another 86-yard passing game from CJ Stroud again. And so I do think that he's a very high upside play this week. And I think last week was just a blip on the radar. Jaden Reed is matched up against Jacksonville this week. Jacksonville's pass defense is atrocious. I think that he does score a touchdown in this one and is a very high upside play. He's also going to be involved in the run game. Then we have Deebo Samuel against Dallas. In the absence of Brandon Ayuk, I think that he is a very high upside play. He was sick this past week, and so who could have predicted that he was just basically going to start and then be a non-factor and not really play? I think he returns to being a very high upside play for us this week, and I do think he scores a touchdown, making him a very strong low-end wide receiver one. And now we have wide receivers that I think are safe wide receiver ones, but I wouldn't project to be the wide receiver one overall. We have BTJ, DJ Moore, and Stephon Diggs. Brian Thomas Jr. in a full PPR format in 3 of the past 4 weeks has scored more than 20 fantasy points and has been a top 10 wide receiver. In the one game in which he didn't score 20 points, he dropped a touchdown and he would have finished with about 14 to 15 full PPR points. So he is becoming a weekly low end wide receiver one. And so against Green Bay, I don't think there's anybody that has, first of all, the speed to match up with him, but also is tall enough. And so I think for that reason, he's a very strong play, even if he does see some Jaire Alexander this week. DJ Moore is playing against Washington this week. Washington's defense is pretty bad against the pass. I think Caleb Williams goes off this week, and so I think DJ Moore is a very strong start, and I do think he scores a touchdown in this one. Stephon Diggs is playing against Indianapolis this week. Despite Stroud only throwing for 86 yards this past week, Stephon Diggs was by far the most productive wide receiver. I think Stroud and the entire offense, including Diggs and Dell, returned to being very strong plays for us this week, and I think that he's going to have a very good game against Indianapolis. And now we have wide receivers that I think are elite wide receiver ones with the absolute potential to be the wide receiver one overall this week. We have Malik Nabers, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, ASRB, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, and Drake London. Malik Nabers came down to earth this past week, but it was really more so a product of Daniel Jones didn't have any time to do anything. I believe he was sacked 8 times. I don't expect that to happen again against Pittsburgh. I do think Daniel Jones is going to get sacked by Watt, but I think Malik Nabers is going to return to being a wide receiver one for us, and so I think he's a very strong start. CeeDee Lamb is playing against San Fran. I think he's going to be peppered with targets in this one. I think he and Ferguson have a pretty good day, and so I think that he's going to be a wide receiver one. Jamar Chase is playing against Philly this week. I think that Joe Burrow is going to have to throw the ball a ton in this one to keep up with Philly's offense. I don't think the Bengals defense is going to do them any favors. And so I think that he is a very strong start this week and an absolute candidate for wide receiver one overall. Then we have Amon-Ra St. Brown against Tennessee. For the most part, he's been a 20-point wide receiver for us per game in a full PPR setting. While it is a tough matchup against Tennessee, I think basically everyone in this offense is matchup proof. And so I think he's a very high upside play. Then we have Tyreek Hill against Tampa Bay. Thank you. We're finally able to start skill position players for the Dolphins with confidence again. I think he has a dominant game in this one. I do think he scores a touchdown, and he has the potential to have a blow-up game of magnificent proportion. Then we have A.J. Brown against Cincinnati. He's been a recurring wide receiver one post-injury. I think that continues. Cincinnati doesn't have anyone that can cover him, and so I think he's a very strong start, and I do project a touchdown. And finally, we have Drake London against Tampa Bay. The last time they played him, he had, I believe, over 34 full PPR points. I don't project that again, but I think he's the strongest wide receiver play in the league. Tampa Bay doesn't have anyone that can cover them. Their defense is Swiss cheese. And so I think he's going to absolutely crush them once again this week. And so to conclude, wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver threes this week are Troy Franklin, Rome Odunze, and Wan'Dale Robinson. Wide receivers that I think are probably mid to high-end wide receiver threes this week are Cortland Sutton, Romeo Doubs, Xavier Worthy, Cedric Tillman, MHJ, Terry McLaurin, and JSN. Wide receivers that I think are probably low-end wide receiver twos to potentially mid wide receiver twos this week are Chris Olave, Darnell Mooney, Devontae Smith, Keenan Allen, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, Jalen McMillan, T. Higgins, Devontae Adams, and Jalen Waddle. Wide receivers that I think are probably high-end wide receiver twos to potentially low-end wide receiver ones this week are Zay Flowers, Garrett Wilson, Tank Dell, Jaden Reed, and Deebo Samuel. Wide receivers that I think are safe wide receiver ones, but I wouldn't consider candidates to be the wide receiver one overall are Brian Thomas Jr., DJ Moore, and Stephon Diggs. And finally, wide receivers that I think are solid wide receiver ones with real absolute wide receiver one overall upside this week are Malik Nabers, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, and Drake London. All right, so you know the drill. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Is there somebody that I'm not projecting for enough points as to why they're not on this list? If so, let me know below in the comment section. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, make sure you like and subscribe. I project out all the non-Thursday night games, so make sure to check out my quarterbacks, running backs, and tight end rankings as well. Thanks.